Happy Easter. My name's Pete, and man, just got a great morning planned. I'm just excited you're here. So, in 1508, Pope Julius II, you all remember him, commissioned the artist Michelangelo, who I, for a long time in my life, only thought was a Ninja Turtle, to paint the ceiling of his Sistine Chapel. And at first he refused, because he's like, I'm a sculptor, I'm not a painter, but eventually he set out to it. And it was an ordeal. He painted 10,000 square feet, massive mural, 9 individual pictures depicting God creating and creative Adam and Eve, and then sin in the Garden of Eden, and then 9 pictures of prophets who predicted the coming restoration. Really big deal, right? And while for this whole process, he actually hated it. He wrote to his friends that it was torture, like his neck hurt, he was looking up and paint's dripping in his eyes. When he was finished, what he created is now considered a masterpiece, one of the most notable works of Western art. In fact, there are some people who would say it is one of the greatest artistic achievements of human civilization. It's right up there with the movie Sharknado. I mean, they're basically the same thing. But eventually, like all things, time had its way. 500 years of chapel services with candles and the soot and the smoke rising up, shifting in the foundations causing cracks, the stone that made up the building releasing salt and water leaking through. And over time, this beautiful painting eventually started to decay, started to fade, it started to lose its luster. And what do you do with it? They even had people throughout the years trying to fix it and restore it. They don't know what they're doing. A lot of them made it worse. So eventually, beginning in 1980, a professional group of art restorationists, I guess that's a job, set about to restore the Sistine Chapel. And it was a painstakingly slow and intricate process of resetting pieces, fixing plaster, slowly washing things and touching up where they could and putting on a new application on top of it. 9 years it took these people, costed $4 million. It wasn't cheap. But in the end, the original image was brought back to life. And now when you walk through it, you can see what was originally painted, what Michelangelo actually did when he first touched that ceiling. And as I was thinking about this, as all people do, I guess, it got me sort of wondering, this idea of something beautiful that's lost, a work of art that has gone through this process of decay. It made me think about us, you and me, and the world that we live in together. When we look at ourselves, when we look at each other, are we seeing what was originally painted? Are the colors that our world was originally drawn in the same ones that you and I see today? Or is it possible that what we're looking at is a bit more of a faded, shadow, decayed self? And if that's the case, if what we're looking at around us actually isn't what was originally painted, could that ever be restored? Could that ever be brought back to life? Well, we're here to celebrate something called Easter Sunday, and that is what it is all about. So this morning, I want to just spend a few minutes talking if you could go, how fast can I go through the Bible? We're going to go there fast. I just want to talk about this story of the Bible, of what's happening here and what Easter has to do with it. What does a bloodied cross and an empty grave and all this other stuff have to do with our lives? And we'll see a lot. The story of Easter is something incredible that we're going to share together today. Before we do, I kind of start every time, so I just want to pray. And maybe some of you are like, I don't even know if I believe in this stuff. It's okay. I'm not asking anything of you. I'm just going to pray, and I'm going to ask that God speaks to us, because I believe that he does. And then we'll dive in together. So, Jesus, we invite you this morning. I believe you're there. I believe you're real, because I've met you. I've seen you work, and so this morning I invite you to begin to work. I invite you to begin to speak and to heal and restore and all the things that you want to do. And as people, we come this morning from different places. Some of us, God, maybe we don't know why we showed up. Maybe it's just what you do on Easter. But we invite you, if you're there, go ahead, speak. We're ready, we're listening. What do you have to say to us, God? So we invite you in this place. Amen. All right. I'm going to start this Easter service exactly where you think I'd start it. The second law of thermodynamics. Yeah, we're doing science, people doing it. All right, if you were to Google the second law of thermodynamics, like I did, you might find that the description of it is like, I don't know what you're talking about. And really, here's what happens. Really smart people, scientists, they just want to say normal stuff, but they use like really big words to make you justify them being smart scientists. The second law of thermodynamics is actually something that you and I all know. It's intuitive. We just see it. We experience it all the time. And it says this. It says that everything in the world, everything in nature, everything, if you leave it alone, it will decay. Everything by itself gets worse. Nothing in nature stays the same or gets better if you just leave it alone. Everything gets worse. Scientists say that nature experiences, they use this big word, entropy, which just means everything moves towards death. Everything organized becomes unorganized. Everything clean and beautiful becomes less. That is a law of nature. And you and I experience it. We know it. We see it all the time. You especially see this if you're a homeowner, right? How many of you know that if you do absolutely nothing to your house, despite your wife telling you to constantly do stuff, if you do nothing, it doesn't get better, it gets worse. Have you ever experienced in your entire life your house getting cleaner from you laying around watching Netflix? Never, right? It gets dusty and dirty and cluttered, and the structure itself starts to wear down, right? The foundation begins to shift, the roof starts to leak, the plumbing goes bad, the paint starts to fade and peel. Eventually, the wood itself will start to rot. Have you ever seen an old abandoned house and you're like, that house is abandoned? How do you know? Because it's falling apart. And once it's abandoned, that's the end result. That is the second law of thermodynamics. Everything moves towards decay. Just like the Sistine Chapel in works of art. You have a brilliant artist perfectly painting it exactly the way it was intended, and it's gorgeous. And then you leave it alone, and time just has a way of decaying it. It becomes worse and worse and worse. So here's a question to consider for yourself, okay? What if, when you think about your life, and you think about the lives of the people around you, and you see just pain, and brokenness and suffering, and you look at your relationships that just aren't working and the marriages that are falling apart and things at work being a mess, you turn on the news, you're like, oh God, why did I turn that on? Because it's just horrible. What if what you're seeing is actually not the world that God first painted? What if what you're seeing is actually a faded, decayed, and cracked image of something that used to be beautiful? What if this isn't what we were made for in the first place? And here's another question. If that's true, think about this. What if thermodynamics and whatever, if it's true that everything in nature falls apart and gets worse when left alone, what happens to you when you get left alone? And what if, just what if the reason that so much of our lives feel broken and dysfunctional and don't feel like they're working and things aren't what we feel like they should be, what if the reason for that was because we have been left alone? That there's actually a problem that we, just like every aspect of this natural world and universe, will never get better being left alone, will only get worse. Well, although the second law of thermodynamics and all this art nonsense isn't in the Bible, can I just tell you, that is actually what the Bible is about. That is the story of the Bible. It starts by telling us that God made something really good, really beautiful. He called it good. And then something happened. But if you look at these early passages in the book of Genesis, which literally means beginnings, There's these kind of like, we're not sure if it's literal or metaphorical. It doesn't really matter. There's a point behind him. You see him forming things, and the things are good. And just look at this passage with me. This comes from Genesis in the 2nd chapter in verse 7. It says this. It says, the Lord God formed a man, a person, from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Now, when you read that, it's good to know that in Hebrew, that was written in the Hebrew language, this word breathed is the same word that we would use for spirit. Ruach, it means inspired, means to be breathed into. So what this passage is telling you and I is that what makes you human, what makes you whatever it is that God originally created you to be, isn't DNA or dust or all the things that, physically make me up. The ultimate thing that really brings me to life is God himself in me, living, like breathing into me. Adam and Eve, or the whole human race, what brought us to life was not just natural selection, it was God himself breathing into us. And that means that for me to be what I am created to be actually involves some kind of relationship with my Creator. And these first humans made a mistake and they kicked him out and they didn't want him. And then you see this moment, and this is an interesting passage. In chapter 3, it says this: the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord among the trees of the garden. And I don't know if it's just the way my brain works, but I guess there's a lot of things you could think of when you read that passage. Here's where my mind went. These people are hiding in a bush, but they're not hiding because God Almighty is walking. What in the world? That's not the weird part of the story. That's the normal part of the story. God walking with them in the daytime was the normal thing. Them hiding was because there had become a problem with their relationship. So that means before there was a problem with the relationship, these people lived with God. With him. He was just part of their lives. That was normal. Abnormal is when it started to break. What made it abnormal is when there became a separation. When these people said to themselves, okay, I know that you painted us and we're basically just works of art or whatever, but you know what? We don't really like your involvement. We don't really like you telling us what to do and, dictating all of our stuff. We'd kind of just rather run things ourselves. So how about you just, you take yourself away, God? And here's the artist saying, well, I haven't explained the second law of thermodynamics to you, but you're about to experience it. And where does it leave us? They're kicked out of the garden. They lose access to life itself because life itself is God. Him being a part of our lives, him sustaining us, him keeping us fully alive, him protecting us from the elements of the ash and the wind and the salt that ruins us, him being a part of it. That's life for us. And we kicked him out, and suddenly the relationship is broken, and it just grows further and further and further apart. Is it any wonder then that our image has grown so faded, marred, and cracked? Because at the end of the day, as human beings, our lungs were never meant to breathe without God's breath inside of them. When you inhale, it was always intended that I'm with him. He's with me, he's present. It was always meant to be that way. When they were kicked out of the garden, the greatest loss that came from that was not it's such a pretty view, too bad. No. They lost that. They lost closeness with God. The only one who could sustain us and keep us, we lose, and suddenly now what's left? And so just like a painting that's ignored and left alone in the way that it fades and darkens and loses its luster, or an old abandoned house that you look to, you're like, man, when's the last time somebody lived in there? No longer cared for by an attentive owner. so too I think our very humanity, what makes me what I was meant to be, has faded and it's gone wrong. It's almost unrecognizable. I would say it this way. You can always tell when a house has been abandoned. I think you can always tell when a human has been abandoned. But it's important, again, that we don't lose sight of this. You were not abandoned. You and I were not left. God did not make us like, oh, good luck, people. There's some that want that to be true. Like, oh, maybe God just created and walked away. No. You don't get off that easy. God didn't create and walk away. God created and we told him to walk away. It was our decision. He never intended it. He never said, oh, well, here you go, I'm done. No, he said, hey, I'm here, let's do this together. And we said, no, we want to do this alone. We kicked him out. It was our decision. It was never his intention to paint and then walk away. He created us in order to exist with us. He breathed his own spirit into our lives in order to make us something amazing and something beautiful. And it was always his intention. And here's the cool thing about this and why it's just fun to get together. Church isn't fun. Yeah, sometimes. Depends how long I talk. So, and I got a lot to say, people. No, so if somebody did that to you, I don't want you, get out of here. Your response would be like me, fine, good luck, buddy. But God didn't do that. God didn't say, well, whatever, you want that. No, he said, man, guys, I know you don't understand thermodynamics. This isn't gonna go well for you. And then he watched it not go well. He watched it fall apart and he saw people crying out. And he said, I'm not done with you. I haven't abandoned you. Let's fix this. And so he started a process of restoration. And that becomes the entire story of the Bible. In this thing we call the Old Testament, it tells this story of how God started in what I guess you could say was a very long, painstakingly slow process. He started in one part of the painting, one little area. He called this specific group of people known as the Israelites. And he said, okay, you guys are going to be the first part of the painting, and I'm going to start to restore you. And then the whole world is going to see, and the rest of the painting is going to look and say, wait, we want that. That's beautiful. And they're going to want me to do the whole thing. So we're going to start with you. So he gave them some rules, some laws. Like, this is actually how I want you to live. Let me show you better how to live. But more than that, more than the rules, more than the do this and don't do that, and thou shalt not. That wasn't the ultimate thing that made that part of the painting shine again. What made that part of the painting start to glow again was God himself saying, I am coming back to be with you. So he had them create this little tent. I guess it's probably a big tent, called a tabernacle. They were nomads living in the desert. And he said, I want you to do it a certain way. There's going to be very specific things to it. But when it's done, I'm coming back to dwell with you. And we see this happen in the book of Exodus 40, verse 34. The story tells us that this cloud covers the tent that they had made. And the glory of the Lord, this word glory in Hebrew, Shekinah, means like presence or thickness of the Lord, filled this whole tent they had made. God returned to dwell among his people after all these years, after all this rejection, after all this separation. He finally is back in a tent in the desert somewhere in the Middle East. But hey, look, I can see a spot on the painting that's starting to get better. But as he did this, and this is helpful for us to understand how the Old Testament and then even into the New Testament makes sense. There was a problem that still kind of existed. Like we'd kicked him out, we had made a mess, and now we're ruined, we're faded. Everything is broken, everything's messed up. And so for God to come back, it was like, there's some we gotta do something here. Something has to be done in order for this to be possible. And so this is the first time you begin to, as you're reading the Old Testament, you start to see this idea that's called sacrifices. And if you're like, what does that mean? It means what you think it is. They would literally kill an animal and they'd take its blood and sprinkle it on this place in the tent. You're like, ooh, what is going on there? Why are they doing this? Well, I want to talk about this a little bit because you could read that, and maybe some of you do. You're like, you read this is weird stuff. I don't know, believe this. it's important to know that when they talked about this idea of sacrifice, of killing these animals and things, it wasn't this like, the deity is angry, let's give it meat. Like, what? There was actually a real sort of reason for what they were doing, a real symbolism that meant something to them. And when they talked about it, they often used a word to speak of these sacrifices. And it was a Hebrew word, kippur. Now, kippur has a couple of meanings, but at its root, it means something very much like clean, cleanse, to wash away, or purify. Kippur, if it was used today, could be like disinfect. Like a hospital would need to kippur a room before surgery. Like there's a problem, it's messy, let's clean it up. But in the same way, it could be used in relationships to speak of like to clean up a mess between two people, to make amends or to restore something, to bring things back to the way it's supposed to be. And so they would speak of these sacrifices of Kippur as part of the making it right process. They thought of it this way. Okay, two people, two things that were always supposed to be together. This is goodness. This is what it's supposed to be. They've grown apart. They've separated. And now something needs to be done. Kippur needs to happen. And you could think of like maybe your small child like going in the fridge and just dumping food all over the floor. And you're like, okay, there's two problems here. Number one, there's a massive mess on the floor that has to be cleaned up. Number two, there's this issue between me and my child of you having disobeyed me. Both of these things need to be dealt with and something needs to happen. This was Kippur. Two things that were apart need to be one again. And so when English people, I don't know, sometime in the Middle Ages, started trying to translate Kippur and make it an English word, they're like, what do we say here? It's like, well, we got two things, and our goal is that the two things become like one thing. We need them to become one, and we need an at one mint. How do we get at one mint? How do we create atonement? It's all about the right syllable. At one mint. Literally, the English word is at one mint. Some point in the last few hundred years, we started saying atonement. But that loses the sight, doesn't it? Like, what does atonement mean? It's at one mint. It's bringing things together. A sacrifice that brings things together. And this was done continually in this tent. And then eventually the tent became a physical building with bricks called a temple. It was the place where God's presence was. And they would offer these sacrifices of at-one-ment in order to keep God there, sort of continually dealing with the problem between us so we could just keep him near us, because near us is the most important thing. If we can just keep him near us. And we believe that the sacrifice was ultimately blood, because blood symbolizes life. And it's our very life that's been affected by this decision. And this innocent blood is being shed as a way of bringing at-one-ment and showing how serious our sin is, how big of a deal it is, how it's disrupted all of life itself. And it's costly now to even have God here in this place. But again, in this place, I mean, in a brick building somewhere on the other side of the planet. Where is this, Israel? Have you ever been there? How do you get there? It's really far away. What is that really accomplishing? Well, this is where we start to get to the good part of the story. Because you begin to fast forward. And what you discover is that when God started the restoration process of this huge mural, he wasn't just like, let's start with Israel, and that's all. No. He was starting with Israel. His plan, though, was for the whole thing. How do you restore the whole thing? You don't restore the whole thing just by having the presence of God in one little building in one little corner of the earth. That doesn't restore the whole thing. That's just maybe that little corner of the earth and the few people that can actually get there. And so comes Jesus, God made man walking among us. And there comes a moment where he gives up his life, and they nail him to a cross, and his blood begins to flow. He dies, and they bury him. It's like, what's happening here? Well, the Apostle Paul, a follower of Jesus, would later think about it and explain it this way. In Romans 3:23, he says, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of at-one-ment, the shedding of his blood. Jesus, the Lamb of God, because they used to use lambs and other animals like that, is a sacrifice of at-one-ment, bringing things back together that have been separated. Too often, I think we talk about, the cross or Jesus dying as all in like forgiveness language, like, hey, I'm sorry, you forgive me? Okay, cool, we're good. It's more than that. That has to happen, but it's about cleaning up the mess. It's about looking at the painting and saying, this isn't what it's supposed to look like. Let's start doing something with it. But with Jesus, it's different than just an actual lamb or a goat or something. This is something completely different that happened. With Jesus, it's not just this one time in this one place. With Jesus, it's once and for all. Because again, what good is God in some building in the middle of nowhere out in a desert somewhere on the other side of the planet? The Apostle Paul comes back in another letter to the church in Corinth, and he says this in 3:16, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? You are God's temple. And God's Spirit dwells in you. How is that possible? I thought, how is that even possible? Because the sacrifice of atonement of Jesus, when we accept it in our lives, makes all of us capable of once again experiencing and holding the presence of God. Which I want to be clear here, is not a new thing. It is a restored thing. It was God breathing his Spirit into the first humans, and then God now breathing it back into us. What we're seeing here, what we gather together to celebrate on Easter Sunday, is that God didn't want to just fix one part of the painting. He wanted to fix all of it, including you. And his sacrifice of at-one-ment on the cross, when he walked out of that grave is empty. I'm walking into something that was empty, is not empty anymore. You and I. Easter tells us that because of Jesus, you and I can be what we were made to be. You and I can experience the life we were made for. We can start to look like the kind of artworks that God originally designed when he painted us because he is back. The artist has joined the scene again. And this is his greatest gift, that these old abandoned houses aren't empty anymore. And all things left alone decay and fall apart, but we're not left alone anymore. We don't have to decay and fall apart anymore. Jesus has given us the one thing we most need to be the kind of people and human beings we're made to be, himself. Easter is all about the artist coming back to his painting to see it restored, which I know can be a lot of like philosophical, artsy stuff. What does that really mean? What does that actually look like? Is there anything practical here? Let me give you two practical things. First is this. This same scriptures, the same Bible tells us something about how we respond to it. It actually tells us that this sacrifice of at-one-ment to bring God back into your life is free. You don't have to do anything for it. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to be good enough. You don't have to clean yourself up. You don't have to wear your church clothes that I bought at JCPenney yesterday. Whatever. Like, you don't have to do anything. Does JCPenney even exist anymore? I don't know. You don't have to do anything. But you do have to accept it. He's not going to force himself on you. God isn't just going, move over, I'm in charge. Like, no. If you want me, I'm here. You have to say to him, hey, I want you back in my life. He's paid the price. He's done everything necessary for it to happen. The only thing standing between you and him now is your own ego. Will you invite him back in? However, once you invite him back in, well, this is where sometimes as Christians we get a little stuck. Oh, I invite him back in. I'm a Christian now. I'm whatever. I'm saved. What is that? Were you saved from what? Well, from the broken painting. Your painting still looks pretty broken to me. Once the artist joins your life again, well then, the artist wants to do some work on the painting. The artist shows up and says, hey, man, let's start here. Come and follow me and let's work on this area. Hey, this thing over here, this is leading to brokenness. Hey, this crack over here, let me show you how to heal it. Hey, this faded area over here, let's talk about how we can retouch it up. But it's not you doing work. It's not you making things happen. It's you once again living the way you're called to live in close relationship with him. It's letting him join the process. and watching his spirit inside of you begin to bring things back to what they were meant to be. It's like looking at yourself as this kind of faded, old, cracked painting, and an artist shows up with his little paintbrush in hand. He says, hey, okay, I'm back. I'm here. Let's get to work. Yeah, my marriage is so broken. Let's talk about it. Trust me here. Follow me here. Oh, but you don't know all this stuff. Trust me here. And once we welcome him back into our life, he steps in and he says, hey, let's start making something beautiful again.
My heart is filled with so much anger and bitterness, it's ruining me.
That's not the picture I painted. Let me show you how to let go and love again and see it restored.
My family is a wreck. My marriage isn't what I hoped it would be. My kids aren't thriving. This isn't the life I dreamed of.
If you trust me enough to follow me and try it my way, you'll be amazed at what can happen.
I've been hurt by church and don't know if I can trust you with my life again.
Come back and find me for the first time and see my goodness apart from what anyone else has said or done.
I just don't think I'm good enough, that I really have anything of value to give.
That's because you've never had a chance to see the painting as I originally intended it. Keep watching.
I just can't forgive what's been done to me, and I feel like it's destroying me from the inside.
If you listen to me calling you to let go and choose to forgive, I promise you will find my goodness when you do.
I feel hopeless and despair, that my life has no meaning or value, and nothing will ever be what I hoped.
I walked out of the grave and defeated death itself. Trust me, I got this.
I feel broken and ruined from my mistakes of my past. There's no way I could ever be what God truly made me to be.
Let me in, trust me to do a work in your life, and you will see the beauty I can make from these ruins.
Easter is not just a religious thing we do, guys. Maybe some of you are like, are you sure I'll go to church? Glad you're here. The reason why we make a big deal out of this day, the reason why I make a big deal out of this day is because when I first said yes to Jesus, when I said, painter, come back in, 25 years ago, he started a work in my life that isn't finished. I'm still not quite there yet. But man, I've seen beauty from ashes. I've seen him take ruins, broken down buildings, and start to restore and heal. I've watched him do it in my life. And I'm not alone. There's so many others. Some of you sitting in this room who can say the same thing. You've watched God move and change and bring hope and healing in your heart and your life. I believe it because I've seen it. I believe in the artist's work because I have watched him get to work, and something better always comes out of it. His way is always more beautiful than my own. And I'm not alone. Before we end today, I'd love for you to hear the stories of some other people dealing with pain, hopelessness, brokenness, and dysfunction, and who themselves have also seen the artist bring beauty out of ashes and restore that which has been ruined.